I don't think anyone actually likes commuting. According to a recent survey conducted among me, even people who like trains don't like commuting. But up until the late 1990s, there was one line in particular that became notorious among its regular users. This is the story of how the Northern Line became the Misery Line. So this is another of those situations where we have to dive into history. The Northern Line is actually two lines imperfectly joined together. One is the City and South London Railway, which originally ran from King William Street in the city to Stockwell in South London and opened in 1890. The other is the Charing Cross, Euston and Hampstead Railway, which ran from Charing Cross in the West End to Camden Town. At Camden Town, it split into two branches, one going to Golders Green, the other going to Archway. The Charing Cross, Euston and Hampstead Railway, better known as the Hampstead Tube, was opened in 1907 by Underground Electric Railways of London Limited, better known as the Underground Group. In 1913, the Underground Group took the City and South London Railway over and joined both lines together. This resulted in two junction stations where the two lines connected. One was at Kennington in the south, and the other was at Camden Town in the north. The one at Camden was really the big one. You had lines branching off in 4 different directions. Incredibly, the work needed to connect the City and South London and the Hampstead Tube was done without causing disruption to services, and was completed in 1924. But what this meant was that you had two bottlenecks with the potential to disrupt services. Bad enough on an ordinary railway, but the Northern Line is one of the busiest commuter routes in London, with trains every couple of minutes. Kennington has a loop line which enables trains to terminate, but there's no such facility at Camden. Signalling at Camden is notoriously difficult, and it's really a testament to the skill of the signallers that the whole thing doesn't just fall apart all the time. So those are the challenges that face the men and women who keep the Northern Line going, at the best of times. But in the years following the Second World War, it really was not the best of times. While there were lots of great ideas for improving the line, there wasn't the willingness to invest the money needed to bring them to fruition. Underinvestment was a problem for the Underground as a whole following the war, but the Northern Line was particularly badly hit. First, there was the issue of overcrowding. This had been a problem on the Northern Line for decades. At stations like Clapham North, Clapham Common and Angel, the platforms were proving ridiculously inadequate. In fact, by the time of the Second World War, plans were in place to build a second set of tunnels below the current tunnels from Belsize Park to Clapham South to enable express services to be run. This was considered a top priority project, so of course it didn't get built. Although there were some initial diggings at the relevant stations which were turned into air raid shelters, which you can still see. So, the Northern Line was not only busy, but too busy. Overloaded, in fact. Then there were the trains themselves. In 1938, a new type of train had been introduced, known as the 1938 stock because names are hard. This was a pretty great train in its day. It's just a shame that by the end of the 70s their day had long gone and they were still in use. In the 50s a new type of train, the 1949 stock, was introduced. In 1969 there was an industrial dispute at Acton Works which produced components for the Northern Line train and resulted in a shortage of rolling stock. London Transport responded to passenger complaints by essentially ignoring them and acting like nothing was wrong. In 1970, new trains were authorised, but these had been designed for the Victoria Line. Now, externally, one tube train looks very much like another. But in reality, every underground line has its own specific requirements. The Victoria Line had automatic train operation, and the Northern Line didn't. So the new trains, 1972 stock, had to be adapted. Then, from the mid-70s, trains of 1959 stock found themselves being transferred to the Northern Line. So as you can tell, the fleet of trains was a rather disparate lot with different driving and maintenance requirements. Standardisation isn't very interesting, but it does make it easier to run a regular train service. The stations themselves weren't altogether pleasant either. The stations were gloomy and dirty. The section around Clapham and Tooting became notorious for crime, and the West End section for vagrancy. The escalators at many stations were reaching the end of their working lives. Nice stations were not seen as a priority as long as they worked. And yes, in theory that's a fair point, but in practice it's not great for what we might call the passenger experience. So what was done? Well, in the 70s and 80s, a programme of refurbishment was carried out. Stations were redecorated and in some cases rebuilt, and lighting was upgraded from old-fashioned bulbs to fluorescent tubes. One interesting idea that came out of the construction of the Victoria Line in the 60s was that stations should have their own identity. On the Victoria Line, each station had a unique tiling motif, and stations on the Northern Line were treated in a similar way when they came up for refurbishment. I find this interesting because, again, it's something that in theory doesn't matter at all, but I think those touches of individuality amidst the corporate identity make the journey just a little bit more pleasant. Not to mention that it's easier to identify your destination if you weren't paying attention. Not that that's ever happened to me. In 1985, initiatives were taken to tackle crime. These included the installation of CCTV and help points, plus patrols by British Transport Police in areas of high crime and liaising between staff and police. These measures caused crime to drop by more than half, and these days you're more likely to be robbed at the ticket machine, am I right? Haha. Yeah. In the late 80s, cleaning was stepped up. This not only made the stations look nicer, but reduced the risk of fire, which had been another source of delays. Most fires are very minor, but for safety reasons everything has to stop until the fire brigade have investigated. New sidings were built at Edgware, Morden, Highgate and High Barnet, which meant that there was somewhere to stick trains that had broken down or otherwise been delayed, in order to get services back, as it were, on track. In 1998, the problem of outdated trains was finally solved with the arrival of 106 new trains. These are the 1995 stock, because their introduction was delayed. These are not only more spacious and advanced, but they have regenerative braking systems which generate less dust and keep things that little bit cleaner. One of the big proposals that keeps getting made is that the Northern Line should once again be split in two to make operation easier. Calls for this were renewed with the announcement of a new branch to Battersea Power Station, and the likely increase in passengers. The great problem here is, once again, Camden Town. If you split the line in two, suddenly you'll have thousands of passengers who once got a train all the way home having to change at Camden. Camden Town simply doesn't have the capacity to cope with that. To be honest, Camden Town doesn't have the capacity to cope with the passengers it already has. Proposals have been put forward to rebuild the station and they've been met with local opposition. The increased size would result in the destruction of a number of local venues and markets. Mind you, Camden's pretty lame these days, so I don't see it as much of a loss. Nevertheless, it seems unlikely that the Northern Line will split any time soon. These days, the Northern Line mostly seems to have shaken off its reputation as the misery line. Improvements are an ongoing thing, so it's hard to draw a line and say, at this point, it was no longer the misery line. No doubt there are plenty of viewers who disagree with me and say that it still deserves that name. But conducting intensive research using the first page of Google results, it seems that the railway line out of Fenchurch Street now has the title. I've also seen it applied to the District Line. To return to the point I made at the start of the video, any line can be the misery line, if you hate it enough. Hello all, I do hope you enjoyed this miserable tale from the tube. If you did, please click the like button and subscribe for less depressing content in the future. Thanks as always to my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon. You are the influx of joy to my miserable commute. And I'll see you all again very soon for another tale from the tube.